Cite chapters, don't cite influencer.
Am I going to use One Piece controversy to talk about science, journalism, and research? You betcha. So my buddy Runner, go follow him, has been having an ongoing discussion about the size of the One Piece world. I think he's on like video 7. And I gotta hand it to him, dude has a mind for science, research, and journalism. Because even though this is a discussion about a manga, he is handling it like a research project. That clip I just showed you, that was his way of saying something that you probably heard back in middle school. When doing a paper, when making an argument, when doing research of any type, cite primary sources. You remember that lesson about primary and secondary sources? Well, you'd be excused if you haven't, because we live in the world of the internet, and the internet is basically one huge secondary source. So let's go over a refresher, shall we? When you are researching or writing about a thing, primary sources are the closest you can get to that thing. So in the case of science, if you are talking about the findings of a research paper, your primary source would be that paper. Not an article talking about that paper, not a video talking about that paper, not an influencer paraphrasing stuff about the stuff that they talked about that paper, not even me. Primary source is the paper, or even better, the data that went into the paper, but that's not always available. That is a super useful thing to know if any of you want to go into journalism, research, or academia. But even if you're not, let's relate this to the One Piece discussion, right? The primary source here is the One Piece manga. That is the thing you are talking about. That is the primary source. Secondary sources are anything further removed from the topic that you are talking about. So in the example of science, like a YouTube video you see on a research paper, that's a secondary source. And in the case of this One Piece argument, an influencer who did some pixel scaling, that's a secondary source. A secondary source interprets the primary source. And in school, we were taught, do not use secondary sources, or at least use them as little as possible, because secondary sources have bias. And most secondary sources these days are built to drive engagement, so they're not particularly accurate. Now, many times when I talk about science, I will show secondary sources in screen caps, right? But I haven't stopped my research there. I've gone and I've read the paper that those secondary sources are talking about. It's just when it comes to science, there's usually a lot of numbers and complicated language in the primary source. So the secondary sources help illustrate the point really quick. But if the secondary source is inaccurate, I don't use it. If the secondary source is making interpretations that the primary source does not, I don't use it. Which brings us back to this One Piece discussion. Saiga has been saying over and over and over again that nowhere in the manga is it shown that the One Piece world is huge. For all intents and purposes, with everything Oda has said and everything that we've read in the manga, it is simply the fact that things are happening at a pretty normal scale. And claims otherwise tend to use pixel scaling on objects that are explicitly not drawn to scale as if they were drawn to scale. At that point, you're talking about a secondary source. You're talking about someone who has interpreted the manga in a certain way. The primary source doesn't say that. Arguably, if Oda wanted us to know that the One Piece world was so huge, he would have made that explicit. When the size of a world is important to a sci-fi or fantasy manga, that size is explicit. Like, Big Mom's size is very explicitly shown to be abnormal. But otherwise, we are shown human-sized people doing human-sized things on human-sized scales, so it is more correct to think that the One Piece world is human-sized, because the person who wrote it is a human, and his references were things from the real world. Now, of course, that could be contradicted. New evidence could come out, like a new chapter could drop, and it could be like, oh yeah, the world is huge, but that hasn't happened. We don't have a primary source, so you cannot cite secondary sources as authority. Secondary sources are just opinions. They're about as valid as anything that comes out of my mouth. Always cite primary sources first. And like I said, that's difficult in the age of the internet, but you should try to do it anyway.